Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's chat. My name is Trinia, and I'm a team member here at Understood. And today we're going to be talking about how to boost executive function skills. And we've got Bob Cunningham joining us. Hi, Bob. How are you?
Hi, Trinia. I'm well, thanks.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us. We're really excited for today's chat. And I wanted to start by asking you if you could just introduce yourself to everyone so that they know who they're talking to.
Sure. My name's Bob Cunningham, and I'm the kind of expert in residence at Understood around learning and attention issues. I also have a career in education of kids with learning and attention issues, working with their parents and their teachers. I've been a public and private school administrator. I spent some time teaching at Teachers College at Columbia University, and work with several philanthropic organizations that support causes around kids with learning and attention issues. So I'm excited to be here. And the only thing I always ask the audience is if you can tell me how old the child is when I answer a question, that is super, super helpful. So I'm thrilled to be here, and hopefully I'll be able to provide some help and to learn a little from our audience as well. So
awesome. Thanks for joining us, Bob. And that's a really good point. So if you do have questions to ask today, you can just type them in the chat box. And if you can give us details like the age that your child is, that would be super helpful. Even if you don't have questions, you can go ahead and introduce yourself on the chat box just so we know who's listening and who's there. And feel free to interact with each other. A lot of times the best advice comes from other people who are dealing with the same sorts of issues that you're going through. But hopefully the answers that Bob can give us today will be helpful. And to get us started, as everyone is asking their questions, I thought we would start with a little introductory question. So I imagine that a lot of our viewers today have general knowledge about executive function skills. But Bob, can you give us an overview of what executive function skills look like and how they help students learn?
Sure, absolutely. So executive function skills are actually cognitive processes. So they are things that occur in the brain and help us, all people, manage ourselves. So if you think of executive functions as kind of the things that a CEO would do, you're in pretty good standing. But I want to emphasize that everyone has executive functions, and everyone has executive functions that are stronger and weaker than others. So these are normal kind of cognitive processes, things that happen in people's brains. And specifically when we talk about executive functions, we're talking about three cognitive processes, one of which is working memory. And I can go into the real definitions of these kind of things a little bit later if people want to know. But working memory is basically your ability to hold something for a short period of time in your mind and act on it. So it's to make it useful. Cognitive flexibility is the other cognitive process that we talk about. And cognitive flexibility is the ability to think of different possibilities. In other words, to use your experience and your knowledge to think of possible outcomes of situations and actions, to think of possibilities for how you might solve a problem, that sort of thing. And the last cognitive process associated with executive function is really inhibitory control. And that's your ability to sort of inhibit kind of your first reaction. And that has to do with self-control and those kinds of things as well. So working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control are the three cognitive processes that really go into executive functions. Much simpler version, things like planning and organizing and following through and starting tasks and that sort of stuff. So what it takes your brain to really get you doing what you need to do. That's functioning.
Awesome. Thank you, Bob, for that introduction. Maybe we can start with, I've got a question here with someone who's looking to help their 14-year-old develop their executive functioning skills, and really just wondering where to begin with this process. It says that the 14-year-old also has ADHD.
Yeah, so executive functioning issues and ADHD often go hand in hand. There's a debate right now, actually, in the professional community as to whether executive function issues can stand alone or have to actually be part of other conditions like ADHD. But kids with ADHD often have difficulty with executive functions. I'm glad we're starting with a question about a 14-year-old, because one of the things that I'll get kind of out of the way right now is that executive functions can always be improved. These are cognitive skills that little kids, adolescents, and adults can all work to improve. So it's good that we're starting with a question from somebody who's concerned about a 14-year-old. To start, figuring out which of those three cognitive processes really are kind of the most impacted could be helpful. So do you have a child or an adolescent who has difficulty with that cognitive flexibility? In my work, that's what I see most frequently, is kids with executive functioning issues who have difficulty predicting the outcome of their actions, their attitudes, trying to figure out multiple ways to solve a problem, or picking just kind of one strategy and going with it, right? So if you have a child who is disorganized, our temptation is to give them 5 strategies that can help with organization. If you have a child with executive function issues, don't do that. Give them one strategy, have them try it, work to support them on it, and stick with it for several weeks to see if that's the right strategy for them. If not, then you can switch to another strategy. But go with one at a time. That's super important when we talk about executive functions. So that's where I would start. If you're concerned about organization, pick one strategy. Use a checklist. Give the kid 3 things he has to do every morning in order to get himself out the door, and just go with those 3 things with frequent reminders, that sort of stuff. But pare back on everything else you're asking them to do. Parents love their kids. They're concerned about this. They tend to throw a whole bunch of direction, a whole bunch of information at the kid all at once. That will absolutely backfire every time.
Those are some really great points. Thanks for sharing that. I have a question for a 10-year-old that is having trouble getting ready in the morning. And do you have any practical advice for daily routines, specifically with getting ready in the morning and getting out of the door?
Yes. So as the adult, presumably with better executive function skills, one of the things you can do is help identify what's called a critical path, right? So what things are on the critical path to helping that kid get out the door? It might be that he or she is just trying to do too much in the morning. It might be that he or she is overwhelmed by all the possibilities of things that could be done. So helping the child to actually prioritize. Look, here are the 3 things you absolutely must do. You must brush your teeth, you must pack your backpack, and you must get dressed. And if you do those 3 things, you will get out the door on time, right? So work on those 3 things. Sometimes it helps to have a little picture schedule, even for a 5th grader. Or a checklist that the 5th grader can use to kind of monitor where they're at on those 3 things. And that can just be as simple as putting the name of those 3 things up on the bathroom wall or the bedroom door. If a child really has difficulty, and it's sort of an extreme case, I always recommend putting that list somewhere other than the bedroom or the bathroom, like out in the hallway or close to the front door, so that the child actually has to walk to the list after each item and then walk back and do the next, then walk to the list and walk back. That sounds a little silly, but motion and movement and those kinds of things can really help a child to organize himself if he has executive function issues.
Awesome, thanks. I have a question from Maria. She says, I'm hoping to get some ideas to help my 7th grader with his executive functioning skills. And specifically how to share the importance of executive functioning with teachers. So how can parents work with teachers on these skills?
That is a great question. So I'm going to answer this kind of 2 ways. I could interpret that question as the teachers who are working with my kid don't really know that much about executive function, right? So I want to help to educate them as to what kinds of things are difficult for my child and why he's having these types of difficulties. If that's the case, there are great pieces of content on Understood that you can actually email or print and hand to your child's teacher. And the way I would do that is to say, look, I was looking at this and it was so helpful for me in understanding what's going on with my kid that I really just wanted to share it with you. right? So make it about you and what you've gotten from it, and then share it with the teacher. Don't make it about the teacher not knowing what the teacher's doing. That is a non-starter every time for a parent. So make it about you, and you're wanting to share this because it was helpful to you, or because it really painted a good picture for you, or you really got a lot out of it. The other possibility is that you really want to work together with the teacher to develop some strategies you can both use at home and at school to support your child's executive function. If that's the case, then again, I would actually sit down with the teacher and I would have a face-to-face conversation and see if you can agree on the kinds of things that are most difficult for your child, both at home and at school. Is it that he doesn't start things on time or when he should? Is it that he never finishes things on time? Is it that he can't make a plan for a multi-step assignment or project? Is it that he kind of gets lost amongst all the materials that he has to keep organized? If you can agree on kind of the single thing that gets in his way most, then you can both attack that problem together. Again, when teachers and parents talk about these things, they often create laundry lists. That is not helpful. It's not helpful to the parent, not helpful to the teacher, and certainly not helpful to the kid. So look at one strategy around getting stuff started. And it might be that I'm going to, as a teacher, move to your desk and tap your desk when I need you to be looking down at your paper and getting writing. It might be that at home, I'm going to have you seated somewhere specific in the house. I'm going to come, we're going to start together, then I'm going to leave, but I'm going to come and check on you every 15 minutes. That's perfectly appropriate. But you have to agree on kind of one thing, and it should be consistent between home and school.
Thank you. I have a question that it sounds like this parent has identified like a specific executive functioning issue that they're working with. She's working with her 18-year-old daughter on writing. Can you talk a little bit about executive function skills that might be involved in the writing process and how she might be able to help her daughter like format her ideas in order to put them on paper?
Sure. So planning and organization are executive functions, and planning and organization are required to produce coherent writing, right? So students who have difficulty with planning and organization in general are likely to have difficulty with planning and organization in writing. The very best tool for planning and organization in writing are graphic organizers. Understood has a lot of examples of graphic organizers as well as content and kind of how to use them. Even for an 18-year-old, even for a professional writer, graphic organizers are super helpful. For kids with executive function issues, they're really critical to success, right? And it can start with a map or a web of some sort and move on to an outline. If they want to, it doesn't have to go to the outline stage. It can go right to a draft. The other thing that I've done very successfully with kids with planning and organization issues when it comes to writing is talk about it first. So talk about the writing and help structure the thinking so that they're narrowing it down to the three most important things they want to say in their piece, whatever it is, whether it's a story or an expository piece where they're writing about factual information. Any kind of writing is about conveying meaning to a reader, right? So what are the three most important things you want your reader to get out of what you're writing? And just doing that, taking all the clutter away and narrowing it down to three important things can help someone with organizational difficulties a lot. Because again, organizational difficulties often result from too much clutter. So clearing away the clutter, narrowing it down to three important ideas, and then using graphic organizers to expand on those specific ideas rather than on tangential information and stuff like that will be super, super helpful to your daughter.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bob. I've got a couple questions coming in about students that are having trouble remembering directions, beginning work, and turning in homework, especially when there's like multiple assignments or multiple projects going on at the same time. One of these questions was geared towards an 8-year-old, and one of them is towards a 15-year-old. So can you give us some ideas for the different age ranges dealing with these?
Sure. So for an 8-year-old who has ADHD or executive function issues, the idea that he or she will remember multiple assignments and will remember multiple steps to assignments and things like that can sometimes be unrealistic, right? And that's kind of the first thing to face as a parent and as a teacher is, yes, this is what I want him to do, but he is not currently in a place where he can actually do that. So it's not that he's being disrespectful. It's not that he's being lazy. It's that his brain is actually not able to do what I'm asking his brain to do. So once you have that kind of overt realization for yourself and for the teacher with you, then it becomes imperative that the adults step in and provide what's called scaffolding or support to allow the child to be successful there. These are things like accommodations, right? So if a teacher actually writes the directions on the board, that can help. If a child is allowed to pull out their cell phone and take a picture of the directions that are on the board, that can help. If a child is sent an email from the teacher that these are the key directions that you're going to have for your homework. If a child gets the name and number of a peer in the class who can text the child the sequence of directions that they have to follow, that sort of stuff. Those are all appropriate for an 8-year-old, and they're all appropriate for a 15-year-old. So you can do any of those things, and they don't cause too much disruption to that child or to other children or to your time, right? So those are kind of simple things. In order to help a child with an assignment or with competing assignments and break that down, there is no substitute today for a well-constructed calendar. So if your child is not using a digital calendar, a Gmail calendar or something like that, they should be, because that's how they can plan out. And that can also be synced with you, and you can actually look at the calendar and see. And if there are things that are missing, you can ask the question, right? The teacher can also look at the calendar and see. And if there are things that are missing, they can help to fill that in. So using support from the adults, using support from technology is going to be really important for either of those kids to be able to manage time, get things done when it needs to be done, that sort of stuff. If that doesn't work, then you go into modifications, right? So we're asking the kid to actually do too much at once. So as adults, let's agree on what the priority is and have them do one thing at a time, hand that in, and then move to the next thing. For the 15-year-old, that's more difficult because by nature, he's working with multiple teachers. So it's going to require some collaboration amongst the teachers to identify those priorities, but that can all be done through a 504 process, through an IEP process, through an RTI process, or just in conference kind of with the parents and with the other educators. Prioritizing, again, working with kids with executive function as long as I have, the single biggest challenge is for the adults and the kid to get on the same page when it comes to prioritization.
Awesome, thank you. What about executive functioning and impulse control? This question doesn't have very many specifics, but somebody is asking about a 17-year-old male who has poor inhibitory control. So do you have any suggestions on how to help him improve in this area?
So 17-year-old male with poor inhibitory control, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so inhibitory control is something that looks different in younger kids and older people often. And at 17, if inhibitory control is really still a big issue, then things like therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy, are usually pretty important. Depending on other strategies, mindfulness strategies are good for inhibitory control. But things that you do with younger kids, like take a deep breath before you answer, kind of, count to 3 in your head before you make a decision as to what you're going to do next, that sort of stuff can still work. But if you've tried all of those things on the way to being a 17-year-old who's experiencing inhibitory control issues, then oftentimes a more significant intervention like a cognitive behavioral therapy or something like that is a good thing to move toward. because as people get older, the issues they can get themselves involved in become a lot more significant sometimes. And so if inhibitory control is really a major part of your child's life, then looking at kind of real systematic structured intervention with a therapist using a behaviorally based kind of therapy approach is indicated.
We have a further question. This is from a different person asking about a 6-year-old who also seems to be struggling with anger and frustration and possibly some like impulse control when he gets to that level of anger. Mm-hmm. And so this person says that he seems to know right and wrong and that he's not supposed to hit other people. But when he gets to that level of anger and frustration, he sometimes gets physical and without being able to pause and think about it ahead of time. Do you have any other suggestions that you haven't mentioned already for that?
Yeah. So especially with a young child, I will say first and foremost, kids don't just hit for no reason, right? This is a physical response to something, right? So it's incumbent upon the parent and the teachers and the folks at school to take the time necessary to figure out what the child is responding to. You mentioned in the question frustration. Frustration is a common thing that a kid might be responding to and might become physical over. The question is, what is frustrating the child? Is it academic frustration? Is it social frustration? Is it frustration that's rooted in a dynamic with an adult? There are so many possibilities. The other thing to look at is it a result of a traumatic experience that the kid's been exposed to or involved with? Or is the child reacting kind of emotionally to issues that he or she feels are out of his control? Those are the kinds of questions that you could be asking. Social worker, psychologist, teacher, special ed teacher, those are all great resources available at the school to help a parent think this through. But also thinking of your own life. Is there anything going on at home? Was there a loss recently? Is there any kind of relationship issues going on? That sort of stuff. Kids can react to all of those things and their frustration tolerance can diminish. And they can then act out in anger or physically. But a functional behavioral assessment is a form of evaluation that can be conducted by people who really know this stuff at the school. And as a parent, you can ask for that. So you can ask for a functional behavioral assessment to figure out why the child is becoming frustrated and then acting out. If it's an academic issue, you can do things, modifications, accommodations, that sort of stuff to lessen the frustration. If it's a social issue, you can do things, accommodations, modifications, strategies, that sort of stuff. If it's a response to trauma, there are other interventions that are appropriate. So there are things you can do to lessen the intensity of the behavior. But first, you have to know what the kid is reacting to. And with a 6-year-old, the likelihood that he is able to explain it to you is almost non-existent, right? A 6-year-old boy is very unlikely to be able to use words and express thoughts in such a way that he's able to get you to understand what's going on because he doesn't understand. So the adults around him have to understand themselves and figure it out to then help him come to a place where it's not having as big an impact.
Thank you for that. I've got a question basically about the timeline of progress in executive function, and I know you mentioned it a little bit at the beginning, but can you speak more about what exactly, like how long does it take for kids to develop their executive function skills, and how long will they always be behind other students, or will they eventually be able to catch up with their peers?
Yeah, so the answer is we don't know, right? But I'll tell you what I have seen kind of in my experience. And I'll tell you, we do know some things from ADHD research, right? We know that maturity of executive functions and things like that lag several years behind in most kids who have ADHD. So that can kind of be expected. The question as to whether or not they catch up, not in my experience. Somebody who has executive function issues that really interfere with their ability to be successful typically don't catch up. What they do is they learn how to use supports and structures and accommodations and strategies and stuff to get better at it. But the idea that it would be as readily available to them or easy for them as it is for somebody who never had executive function issues is not a practical way of looking at it, right? Developmentally, we know that some people take longer just naturally to develop different cognitive processes. So the fact that a child is a little behind in executive functions doesn't mean that they will always be behind. But if they're behind to the point where it's really impacting their self-esteem, their sense of self-efficacy, their performance kind of in school and in life in general, then the idea that they will kind of grow out of that or develop out of that is probably not realistic.
I've got a couple of questions about trying to help their kids become more independent in terms of doing homework and doing their basic chores around the house. Do you have suggestions for how parents could help them develop these skills and stay focused on their own and do their homework on their own without parents having to nag them all the time?
Yeah, so there's a big difference between homework and chores, right? Let's start with that. So chores are a negotiated thing between a parent and a child. So have those negotiations, pick one or two things, stick with it. Not an option. This is what you do. Reward/apply consequences if a child doesn't or does do the chores. So incentivize and or provide consequences. But chores are really a kind of, in a weird way, a contractual relationship between a parent and child. These are the things you must do in exchange for whatever, in exchange for being a good part of the family, in exchange for having my positive attention, in exchange for $10 a week, in exchange for whatever it is. There's a contractual kind of thing involved with doing chores. That's different than homework. Homework is something that's between the school and a child, right? And so my advice to parents is always to start with conversations with the teacher. Make sure you understand what the teacher's expectations are. Make sure you're using the same language with your child at home that a teacher's using at school around the homework. Secondly, make sure your child can actually do the homework. Like, is the teacher assigning stuff to your child that the teacher is just assigning to everyone? Or does the teacher actually believe that your child can complete this homework? So has the skills, has the knowledge, is able to do everything it requires. It's amazing to me how many times when parents have that conversation with the teacher will say, oh no, well, I know that he's not at the point where he can do that work. Okay, so then why did you assign it as homework to my child? That's a good conversation, and it brings it to a level of awareness and kind of conscious conversation between parent and teacher. So that's the first thing. Make sure your child can actually do what's being asked of him or her. If he can or she can do the homework, has the skills, has the knowledge, has the understanding, then making sure that there's an appropriate space for the child to do a homework in, making sure that there's appropriate time to do the homework in. Different kids take different amounts of time to do homework. That's a fact. So a lot of times I will see kids who are way overscheduled having trouble getting their homework done. That's not a surprise. If the kid is way overscheduled and isn't able to manage all the activities that he or she is involved in or that the family is involved in, the first thing to go is going to be homework, because it's almost always the least enjoyable thing for the child, right? So if you've got a child who does 2 sports after school or is engaged with watching siblings after school or is engaged in kind of different youth activities or kid activities, and there are a whole bunch of transitions in that after school time for a child, that's where I often see homework fall down. And it's because the kid just has too much to manage and homework is just another thing, and it's the least important in the child's eyes, so it falls away, right? So think about that. So make sure the skills are there, make sure the understanding is there, make sure the time and the place are there. again, you can want your kid to be able to do homework in a busy, noisy environment. If your kid is not able to do that, there's no way it's going to work, right? So you have to be able to step aside and say, this is not about what I want. This is about what my child can do. If it gets to the point where you've really looked at it and thought about it, and yes, your kid can do this, he's just making different choices, then that's where you use incentives and consequences again, just like with the chores. That's pretty much as simple as I can make it, and it might be oversimplified, but if you think along those lines with the child, you'll get somewhere with the homework.
Thank you. So we've had so many questions, and we're unfortunately not going to be able to get to all of them. But I do want to end with one last question for you, Bob.
Sure.
On a high note, do you have any suggestions or ideas of games that parents could play with their kids that might help them develop executive function skills?
Yeah, so any kind of puzzles will help to develop executive function skills, right? So start with puzzles. It can be puzzles on a screen. It can be puzzles on a coffee table. It doesn't really matter. It can be puzzles in a puzzle book. Any kind of puzzles are great for kids with executive functioning issues. The trick, though, when you play a game with a kid with executive function issues, and that game requires developed executive functions, right? Talk it through with the child, right? Add that verbal component, add the discussion of it, have the child verbalize to you what they're doing and why they're doing it. That's going to sound really simple, but it is such an important part of actually building the executive functions through gaming. If your child is just doing it, then they're not necessarily learning from it. If your child is doing it and explaining to you why they're making those choices, why they're making those decisions, what they think can happen next, what they think the multiple possibilities for their next step are, that's how you really start to make connections with the child around executive function. Same thing goes for watching television. Screen time is not the enemy of kids with executive function issues. Screen time without that kind of discourse is the enemy. So if your child is watching a movie with you, watching a show with you, watching a movie or show with a sibling, and they are talking about the show with you as it's happening, why is that character doing that? What might happen next? What happened before that you think made that character do that? Those kinds of things, that's all going to build executive functions. So do the fun stuff, but add that explanation and verbal component coming from the kid, and you'll see good results.
Well, those are great ideas. Thanks, Bob. So that is all we have time for today. Thanks so much for joining us, Bob.
My pleasure. Absolutely. Hey, everyone, thanks, Trinia, too. This is actually her first Expert Live event with Understood. So great job, and thanks for facilitating for us.
Oh, thanks, Bob. And for everyone that joined us on the chat today, thank you for being here. And I just want to remind you that you can access all of our archived chats that we've done previously at u.org/calendar. And if you had a question today that didn't get answered, you can also log on to u.org/community, and you'll find a lot of people engaged in conversations, and a lot of times our experts pop on there to answer questions as well. So please check it out, and thanks for joining us today.